I hope you are all doing really well. Today I'm finally getting around to making a video about my favourite films of 2019. I've been meaning to make this literally since January, but better late than never. I've divided up these films into films that I watched last year but didn't come out in 2019, and my favourite films that I saw that came out last year. I wanted to have 5 each so as to have a top 10, but I couldn't narrow it down, so I've gone with 6 each. So to start off the films that I watched last year that were released in previous years is Private Life, directed by Tamara Jenkins. This narrowly missed out on making it into my favourite films of 2018. It was a Netflix original release, so it was one of those films that I really wanted to see but just didn't get the time to actually sit down and watch it until after the Christmas break. This is one of those really quiet American indie films that really kind of snuck up on me as to how much it affected me. It's about this 40-ish aged couple living in New York, played by Kathryn Hahn and Paul Giamatti, and they are trying to conceive a child. They are trying different methods of IVF, and then this sort of distant relative, in terms of that she's not actually related to them but she's sort of like a family friend, she comes to stay with them because she's kind of run away from university, and they ask her if she will donate some of her eggs, which she agrees to. The couple are sort of semi-well-known artists in New York, so the whole film is structured around the idea of choosing either creativity or choosing to have children, and whether it is possible to have both. What I found really interesting was this couple don't seem to be particularly maternal, and their huge desire to have a child seems to come from this place that they don't even seem to realize where it's come from. And it sort of looks at that idea of, well, they never became super famous artists, so they don't exactly have an artistic legacy in the way that they might have wanted to when they were younger, and so they feel like at least, well, they can have a child as a legacy to the world. And just lots of really interesting ideas around that, which I found fascinating. Next is a film from 1941 called The Lady Eve. This stars Barbara Stanwyck as a con artist, and she and her conning friends are trying to con Henry Fonda, who's this absent-minded professor who's just come back from discovering some kind of rare snake or something like that. But then she accidentally falls in love with him, and so is very distraught when he finds out that she is a con artist and breaks off the marriage with her. And then the plot sort of revolves into this incredibly hilarious farce where she decides to disguise herself and go con him again as revenge for breaking up with her. This film absolutely cemented Barbara Stanwyck as my favourite actress from that era. I think she just has everything going for her. She's so good comedically and dramatically, and Henry Fonda does an amazing amount of physical slapstick in this film. It's a screwball comedy that is not as well known, but I think deserves to be up there among some of the greatest. Next is another old film, Stage Door from 1937. This stars an incredible cast of female actors with Katharine Hepburn and Ginger Rogers as the leads. It's about a group of girls trying to make it as actors or performers, and they all live in this big boarding house together. Basically, Katharine Hepburn comes in as this wealthy lady who's just decided she'd like to have a go at acting, and they all resent her for that, especially Ginger Rogers, because they're also all just trying to make a living because they do not have any money to fall back on. I think what's brilliant about this film is not only does it portray women probably more accurately than most films you'll even see these days, but the plot is not at all focused on any kind of romance. Like, there's definitely male characters in it, there's definitely romance in it, but the main focus of the plot is the friendship between the women, and especially the friendship between Ginger Rogers and Katharine Hepburn. And it's just really wonderful to watch a film from a different era that feels like it's really portraying how women felt in that time. It feels like a real snapshot and a side of the 1930s that you just don't get to see a lot on screen. Next, I have A League of Their Own, a 1992 film directed by Penny Marshall. I feel like this is quite a famous film in America. I actually hadn't heard of it until the director died last year or the year before, and a lot of people were talking about this film online as a great film. Looking at the cast, I then realised Bill Pullman was in it, and certainly the latter part of my film watching of 2019 was filled with a slight obsession with Bill Pullman that started with watching Casper around Halloween. That's a whole nother story. Him being in the cast pushed me to watch this one, and he's not in it very much at all, but I'm so glad I watched it because it's this amazing film based on a true story about a group of women in a baseball team during World War II. Because all the men obviously were away at war, the baseball leagues decided they would start some female leagues, and I think initially the idea was it would just be girls in short skirts and that would be the entertainment, but it turns out, of course, that many of the women were very good at baseball. And so you've got Gina Davis and Laurie Petty as these two sisters from a country farm get picked to be on the team. So you have their relationship and their kind of rivalry because the older sister was always seen as the perfect one by their parents. We've also got their coach played by Tom Hanks, who's this awful ex-baseballer, kind of misogynist, kind of drunk now, and you get his slow transformation to viewing the women as proper players and properly coaching them. And as much as I'm disinterested in real sport, sporting movies can be so much fun because there's such a simple goal that the characters are trying to reach, which is to win the game, and it's very easy to get on board and just really enjoy the journey that the characters go on. Next is Before Sunrise, which is the first film in Richard Linklater's very well-known Before series. This one came out in 1995. I'd obviously heard a lot about these films. I didn't really know exactly what they were about, so I had the great pleasure of just really enjoying what was unfolding before me, which is this very simple story of two people who meet on a train in Europe, and the guy Jesse, played by Ethan Hawke, manages to persuade the woman Celine, played by Julie Delpy, to get off the train and spend a day with him in Vienna. And so the whole film is just made up of their conversations in different beautiful locations, and is exactly the kind of film I love. I think what's wonderful about the film is that you get a real insight into what these two characters are really like. Obviously, because they're trying to impress each other, you get that side of them, but the actors are able to very subtly show you what the characters might actually be thinking as well. It's the sort of story that you think would only really work in a novel form, but it somehow manages to work as a film. I read that Julie Delpy and Ethan Hawke contributed a lot to their dialogue, which definitely makes a lot of sense because particularly for me, the things that Julie Delpy says are really only things that a woman could come up with. To me, it has such a level of authenticity that it feels like Julie Delpy is really speaking from her own experience. I did watch the other two movies. I watched Before Sunset soon afterwards, and then I watched Before Midnight earlier this year, and I did enjoy both those films as well, but I think the first one definitely stands out as my favourite. I finished that film excited to know that there were more films, but also if Before Sunrise had been the only film made, I would have been perfectly satisfied with the ending. Finally, my favourite film that I watched last year that was not released in 2019 was Paper Moon. This was directed by Peter Bogdanovich, hopefully pronouncing that right, and came out in 1973, and it's a black and white film set in the 30s during the Depression era. It stars a real-life father and daughter, Ryan O'Neal and Tatum O'Neal, and I believe from reading up on it that their relationship in real life was just as frictious as in the film, if not more so. So it starts off with Tatum O'Neal's character. I think she must be, I don't know, around 8 or 9 years old, maybe 10. I'm really bad at guessing kids' ages. And Ryan O'Neal's character, who's this kind of con artist grifter, he has heard about her mother's death and has rocked up to pay his respects, having known her in the past. He is asked by the other adults at the funeral to take the girl Addie to a relative in a nearby town. They ask him if she possibly could be his daughter, which he denies completely, but there's definitely an implication throughout the film that she is his daughter, and this is especially made apparent when it turns out she is better at conning people out of money than he is. This film's not just a favourite from last year, it's become one of my all-time favourite films. It's just the most delicate, nuanced, subtle film. It so beautifully portrays the era. The characters' relationship is so delicately shown. You feel their inevitable affection and respect for each other without it ever being overdone or on the nose. And following the structure of a road movie, it just beautifully examines these two characters. Again, referring back to Casper, there's something about a father-daughter relationship that I find endlessly fascinating, and this film really is the ultimate portrayal of that relationship from the point of view of a father and daughter who are almost refusing to acknowledge that they have that relationship together. For any Australians watching, that film is now showing on SBS On Demand, so I would very much recommend checking it out. Okay, to get into the films that came out last year, I just want to mention a few that probably were on a lot of people's favourites of 2019 lists that I found kind of overrated. So firstly, Little Women. Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse made a very excellent video about some of the problems with the new Little Women adaptation, which I completely agreed with. But very briefly, I'll just say it was the same with Lady Bird for me. There's something about Greta Gerwig's direction that leaves me very cold, and I really don't get emotionally invested in her characters in the way that I know I ought to be. As much as I appreciated the talent involved in Little women, I did not warm to it in the same way that I really love the 90s adaptation. Another one is Marriage Story. People were really raving about the performances in that, and I didn't think they were anything special, but I think it is down to Noah Baumbach's direction, and he's married to Greta Gerwig, so I don't know what it is about those two, but they do not appeal to me, aside from Frances Ha, which I absolutely love and was their first sort of well-known film that they worked on together. There's a kind of stilted Wes Anderson-ness to the script and the performances in Noah Baumbach's films that just does not appeal to me, and I can kind of appreciate it in Wes Anderson because the entire thing is so specifically constructed, but in Marriage Story I felt like I was meant to be feeling that these characters were very real, and they just did not feel like real people to me at all. Another one is Booksmart. Everyone was absolutely raving about this as like this incredible comedy. I went and saw it with my sister and I thought it was a good comedy, like I enjoyed it, but I think it's the kind of thing that people were raving about because we just don't see female comedies like that very often, and I think in a few years time when that becomes less unique, I think people will see Bookmark as just one of many sort of enjoyable enough comedies. The Lighthouse I technically watched this year, but overseas came out last year, and that was one I really wished I could have left the cinema, but I had to review it for work. It's one of those very male stories with a lot of masturbation that I just don't understand. Just found that film incredibly alienating. And lastly, Frozen 2, which again was a fine enough film, but I just loved the first film a lot, and I've seen it several times, and every time it gets me emotionally in the same way, especially because it is a story about sisters, and I just felt like Frozen 2 was repeating the same character journeys from the first film, which is something that happens a lot with sequels, but is just so disappointing. From a studio that obviously they're a huge conglomeration and have released content of varying degrees of quality, but when it's one of their major films, you think they would kind of put their all into it, especially as this was the first ever cinematic sequel of a Disney princess film. So yeah, that one was a very personal disappointment for me. I have some honourable mentions as well, but this video is going to get too long if I talk through them, so I'll just list them down below in the description box. First up, I have Hustlers, directed by Lorraine Scafaria. I love this film because it was a genre film that just happened to be about women. It really follows the tropes of a big heist thriller style film, and it was really just the kind of film that I would like to see out of my blockbusters. It was so entertaining. It had funny moments, it had dramatic moments, it had great actors playing these big bold characters, but then also added this level of, to me, authenticity simply because it was being viewed through a female lens, in both the characters being female and the director being female as well. It's also the kind of film that was made better by being made by a woman because it is about strippers. The way it was filmed was so non-sexualized. It completely was just either showing off their talent in terms of pole dancing is clearly a very athletic skill, but it didn't shy away from showing the exploitative side to this industry as well, and it managed to do both without it ever feeling like you were meant to be titillated by what you were watching at all, which I think is a very impressive feat. Next, I have another female director, Lulu Wang, with The Farewell. This is one of those films where it came from such a specific personal story from the director that it became universal as a result of that. It has so many lovely things to say about family, about different cultures, about when cultures clash. It really felt like the director's vision realized on screen. And even if the themes themselves are ones that we have seen many times, it felt so completely original and personal and just something that I want to see on screen more. You can tell the director wasn't trying to make a particular kind of film. She was truly just making her very own personal film, which almost felt like a privilege to watch in a way. Next, I have Sometimes Always Never, directed by Carl Hunter. This is a British film starring Bill Nighy, and Sam Riley plays his son, who is one of my favourite actors. Bill Nighy plays a tailor, and his older son has been missing for several years, and so it's kind of about the tumultuous relationship between him and his younger son, with the younger son obviously feeling left out because so much of his dad's energy has been put into his older son, and yet of course the younger son feels guilty about feeling this way. I really love the styling of this film. It has a sort of slightly stilted and very staged look to it, but you have a real authenticity and truth to the performances, so I think that contrast worked really well. A theme running throughout the film is Scrabble. Bill Nighy's character loves playing Scrabble, he loves playing online Scrabble, and so words and their meanings are a massive theme throughout the film, and it's just really sweet and beautifully done. Next is Shaun the Sheep, Farmageddon. I feel like I must have mentioned this on my channel before, but Aardman are my absolute favourite film studio. I love pretty much every film they've ever made. Wallace and Gromit is such a massive part of my childhood, as is films like Chicken Run and Flushed Away, and so a new film by them is just like the most warm and comforting thing for me. This was a lovely experience seeing this film because I got a free preview to review it for work, and my mum and my sister came along as well, and we had such a lovely time. While I didn't grow up with Shaun the Sheep, I did watch it obsessively during year 12. It was one of the things that sort of gave me a lot of comfort during a very stressful time. There's something so incredibly clever about an entire film where there is no dialogue, and yet the characterizations, the comedy, the storyline is better told than most films with dialogue. I think the sci-fi bent to this film really appealed to me because I really got so many of the in-jokes just from having watched a lot of sci-fi as a kid because my dad really loves it. The cinema was full of children, but I'm pretty sure that we enjoyed it way more than any of the kids did. Next, I have Parasite, directed by Bong Joon-ho. While this film was getting raved about in America, I had no way to see it until finally my local cinema re-released it because they had already shown it like way back before anyone was talking about it. I really loved the styling of it. I thought visually it was incredible. All the acting was great. It really made me laugh. It was very dramatic. I love its discussion of class. I love how Bong Joon-ho said he was writing so specifically for South Korea, and yet it has rung true for so many people around the world, and it's definitely one that I want to watch again in the future. And finally, my favorite film from 2019, it has to be Knives Out, directed by Rian Johnson. Being a whodunit, I thought I would enjoy this film going into it. I don't know whether I could say that I'm a fan of whodunits, but my mum and my sister definitely are, so I've just seen a lot by default. And as a result, I just found myself so aware of all the tropes that Rian Johnson was playing around with within the genre that it was just the most enjoyable experience for me. And I really went along with the film as well. It kind of twists the genre around so much that you think it's departed from the genre of the whodunit, and then it sort of comes back around again. And I was totally just like on a roller coaster ride with all the different twists and turns, and really is genuinely the most enjoyable experience I think I've ever had at the cinema. The cast are phenomenal, especially Daniel Craig with this crazy bizarre accent, and they all manage to balance out the comedy and the drama so well that it makes you genuinely care for the characters while also being able to enjoy how over the top everything is. I watched this a second time at Christmas with my parents and I loved it just as much. I think it's one of those films I will be regularly rewatching, and I'm so excited that they're making a sequel. Having Daniel Craig come back for a bunch of films or with different casts, it just sounds idyllic to me. I know some people get to look forward to Marvel films. Well, I am going to be so excited every time a new Benoit Blanc film comes out. So that's the end of my list, but I feel like I can't go without mentioning one of the biggest film events of last year, which was the release of Cats. I am actually quite a fan of Cats. I watched the filmed version of the stage production multiple times as a kid, and my mum had a book which had pictures of behind the scenes of the production as well as all the poems in it, and we saw a stage production of it as well that came to Perth. It was something I was quite obsessed with as a child, so I was kind of excited to see the film, even though visually it looked horrendous, but I was surprised by how much it actually affected me emotionally. I got incredibly emotional at every single song, and more so the more the film got into it, because thankfully all the sort of famous people's songs got out of the way right at the beginning of the film, which just left the professional musical theatre people to do the rest of the singing, and that's when it kind of got good. Obviously it was never going to be amazing because it really truly does look horrendous visually. Not sure if I'll ever watch it again, considering there is a filmed stage version that I have on DVD and I can just watch that, but it was something else sitting in that cinema with a bunch of other people who I have no idea whether any of them were fans, but everyone sat and watched it to the end, so it was truly an experience like no other. Do let me know what your favourite films were from last year in the comments, if you can remember that far back, seeing as we are already so far into 2020. I hope you are all staying safe and well, and I will see you soon. Bye!